My mother-in-law called child services on me, told them I was beating my kids, and smiled in court like she'd already won. She had no idea what was coming. It was 7:14 in the morning when the knock came. Not a polite knock. 3 hard raps. The kind that doesn't apologize for waking you. I'd been up since 6 getting the kids breakfast. Sophie had already dumped half a bowl of oatmeal on the kitchen floor and was pretending it hadn't happened. Oliver was still in his pajamas, dragging his stuffed elephant across the linoleum and narrating a story only he could follow. Normal Tuesday. I opened the door with a dish towel still in my hand. The woman on my porch had a lanyard, a navy jacket, and a clipboard pressed against her chest. She introduced herself as Andrea Moss, Child Protective Services. She said she'd received a report of concern regarding the welfare of 2 children at this address. She didn't ask if she could come in. She stepped past me. "I'd like to speak with you and observe the children," she said. Not a question. I stood there for a moment in my own doorway, dish towel in hand. The morning sun was sharp, and I thought, this isn't real. I'm going to blink and this will resolve into something else. It didn't. Andrea crouched down to Sophie's level almost immediately. Sophie was 5 years old and wearing a tank top because she always ran hot and hated sleeves. And there they were. The bruises on her legs, 3 of them. One on her left shin, faded green and yellow. One above her right knee, still purplish. One on her calf from where she'd slid into the patio door frame 2 days before. Andrea was looking at them the way someone looks at evidence. "Does she bruise easily?" she asked, without looking up. "She's 5, I said. "She climbs everything. She falls off everything. 3 days ago she launched herself off the swing set. I told her not to. She didn't listen." Andrea made a note. She went through my kitchen cabinets, opened the refrigerator, checked the produce drawer, noted the snack shelf. She looked under the sink, at the cleaning products, I think, checking for storage safety. She checked the bathrooms. She asked Oliver very gently if Mommy ever got angry. Oliver stared at her with his enormous brown eyes and said, "Mommy got angry when I drew on the wall." Andrea wrote that down too. My hands were shaking by the time she sat across from me at the kitchen table. Sophie had wandered back to her cartoons. Oliver had relocated to my lap. I was holding him like a life preserver. "Who made the report?" I asked. "Can you tell me that?" She hesitated. Then she said the report had come from a family member who stated they had personally witnessed evidence of physical abuse. She didn't say the name. She didn't have to. I already knew. Patricia. My mother-in-law had called the state abuse hotline and told them I was hurting my children. I called David while Andrea was finishing her notes in the living room. He was in Seattle, had been there since Sunday for a company off-site. I stepped into the laundry room and shut the door and called him with my hands still shaking. "There's a CPS caseworker in our living room," I said. "Your mother called them. She told them I was abusing Sophie and Oliver." Silence. David. Are you sure it was my mom?" And there it was. The thing I had been afraid of. Even standing in my own laundry room with a state investigator in the next room, his first instinct was to doubt me. "The caseworker confirmed it was a family member," I said. "Who else would have called David? Who else comes to this house every week and would know specific details about Sophie's bruises?" More silence. "She loves those kids," he finally said. She wouldn't do something like this to us." I told him to book the next flight home. Then I hung up and stood in the dark of my laundry room for 30 seconds before I walked back out to face Andrea. To understand what Patricia did, you have to understand who Patricia is, and who I am, and how those 2 things were always going to end this way. I'm 34. David and I have been together for 9 years, married for 6. We met in Chicago, where I was working nights at a diner off Michigan Avenue and taking classes at Harold Washington College during the day. I was 25. I was tired all the time. I had $2,200 in a savings account and a plan that was just barely holding together. David found me charming. I found him steady. We fit. His family did not find me charming. Patricia Hargrove was old Connecticut money, not the aggressive kind, the quiet, confident kind that doesn't need to announce itself because it's been there long enough that everyone already knows. She sat on the board of the Ashfield Academy, a private school that charged $38,000 a year. She belonged to a country club where she played doubles tennis on Tuesday mornings and had lunch with women who wore blazers even in July. She had opinions about everything, delivered with such practiced composure that they almost didn't register as judgments. Almost. The first time I met her, she asked me what my family did. I told her my dad drove for UPS and my mom worked reception at a dentist's office. She smiled and said, "How practical." I was 26. I didn't understand yet what she meant by that. I understood later. She never liked me, but for the first 4 years, she managed it well. Polite distance. Perfectly maintained. We got along the way 2 countries get along when it's in neither one's interest to go to war. Sophie was born in March of 2019. Oliver in June of 2021. Patricia became a grandmother and something shifted in her. She wanted more access, more influence. She started showing up more frequently, wanting to be involved in decisions. Which preschool, which pediatrician, which activities. We listened. We included her where we could. David was close with his mother, and I respected that. The trouble started the previous September, 14 months before the CPS visit. David was promoted to VP of operations at his company. The compensation package was real. $245,000 base, significant stock options, a bonus structure that for the first time in our married life made us genuinely comfortable. We bought a house in Ridgewood, New Jersey. Nice neighborhood, good schools, room for the kids to grow. Patricia saw the new house and decided it was time to reorganize our lives. She started suggesting we move to Greenwich, where she lived. Better schools, she said. Better environment. She offered to pay the tuition at Ashfield, the school on whose board she sat. She talked about the opportunities it would open for Sophie and Oliver. She mentioned social networks in a tone that made the word sound like infrastructure. We said thank you. We said we were happy in Ridgewood. We said we'd keep it in mind. She escalated, came to David directly, said she was worried we were limiting the children's potential, said she'd always hoped he'd raise his family close to home. She started CCing David's father, quiet, conflict-averse Edward, on emails about school options as if building a coalition. We said no, clearly, together. And David did something I had not seen him do before. He sat across from his mother at her her dining room table, with the good china set out and the afternoon light coming through the bay window, and he told her we were not moving to Greenwich, we were not enrolling the children at Ashfield, and we were not going to revisit this conversation. Patricia's composure didn't crack, but something behind her eyes did. "You don't understand," she said very quietly, "what it means to raise children at your level now, what's required, the environments that shape them." David told her that he appreciated her concern. That was the end of the visit. On the drive home, I told David that something had changed. He agreed. We talked about setting clearer limits going forward. What we didn't do was stop the weekly visits. She was their grandmother. The kids loved her. We thought we could manage it. We were wrong about that. The weeks after David's refusal were when I started noticing things I should have noticed sooner. Patricia began arriving at our house with a specific kind of attention. She wasn't just playing with the grandkids. She was observing, cataloging. One afternoon in October, she was watching Sophie and Oliver in the backyard while I made lunch. When I came back out, she was crouched down, examining Sophie's shins with the focused intensity of someone doing inventory. Sophie had a fresh scrape from the concrete patio edge. "She falls a lot," Patricia said. Not to Sophie, to me. "She's energetic," I said. Patricia looked at me, then looked back at Sophie, then stood up and smoothed her slacks without saying anything else. A week later, she was sitting with Oliver at the kitchen table while he colored. I passed through the room and heard her asking him questions. Soft voice, the kind you use with small children. "Does mommy ever get really upset? Does mommy ever yell? Does mommy ever hurt you when she's upset?" I stopped in the doorway. Oliver said, "Mommy yelled when I broke her phone, but she wasn't upset for very long." I walked into the kitchen and asked Patricia what she was doing. She looked at me with that perfectly calibrated expression of hurt innocence. "I was just talking to my grandson. I let it go. I shouldn't have let it go, but at the time I was trying to maintain something. I was still in the part of the story where you convince yourself you must have misread it." The next visit, she came with her phone out, taking pictures, she said, of the kids for a photo album she was putting together. She photographed them in the kitchen, in the backyard, on the living room rug. What she was actually photographing, I later understood, was their bodies, their bruises, the marks of a normal, active childhood that she was assembling into something else. I planted a detail then, without knowing it. I mentioned casually that we were taking Sophie to Dr. Helen Yun the following Tuesday for her 5-year checkup. Patricia asked several questions about it. I thought she was just being attentive. She was marking a date on a calendar. 3 days after that appointment, the knock came. The investigation took 11 weeks. 11 weeks during which a stranger had the legal authority to appear at our door unannounced and check whether our children were safe from us. 11 weeks during which David and I had separate interviews. The kids had separate interviews, conducted by a child psychologist in a room with toys and a one-way mirror. Our friends were contacted. Our neighbors were contacted. Our families were contacted. The pediatrician, Dr. Helen Yun, was the key. She had been treating Sophie and Oliver since their respective births. She knew them. She knew their medical histories. When Andrea requested an expedited consultation during the investigation, Dr. Yun submitted a detailed written assessment. Sophie's bruise pattern was entirely consistent with normal childhood activity. Dr. Yun also noted something she had observed and documented at Sophie's 5-year checkup: a mild reduction in bone density in Sophie's lower legs, a not uncommon finding in active young children that could explain the frequency of visible bruising from even minor impact. This mattered a lot. It meant there was a clinical explanation for why Sophie bruised more easily than other kids her age. It meant the thing Patricia had been photographing and cataloging for weeks, the purple, yellow-green constellation of a fearless little girl's shins, was a medical footnote, not a crime scene. But here's the thing Dr. Yun told me. 6 weeks into the investigation, when I met with her privately, she had received a phone call before the CPS report was filed. A woman who identified herself as a family member asked if she could access Sophie's and Oliver's medical record. Yun's front desk had asked for written authorization. The woman said she would follow up. She never did. That call came in on a Wednesday. The CPS report was filed on the following Monday. Patricia hadn't panicked and reached out impulsively. She had tried to access the children's medical files first. When she couldn't get them, she filed anyway and let the investigation do the work for her. She was methodical. She had a plan. She had been executing it for weeks. I went home that night and sat at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, and I thought about every visit in the previous 3 months, every question she'd asked Oliver, every photograph, every lingering look at Sophie's legs, every casual inquiry about our schedule. I had been watching her build a file. I just hadn't understood what I was watching. David sat across from me. He'd been quieter since the investigation started. Ashamed, I think, of that first phone call, of his first response being doubt. "She planned this," he said. It wasn't a question. "She planned this," I confirmed. The investigation closed as unfounded on a Thursday in February. Andrea called to inform us. No evidence of physical abuse. No evidence of neglect. Our children were safe and healthy. Our names would not appear on any registry. I hung up the phone and cried, not from relief, from something more complicated than relief, from the understanding of what had been done to us, and by whom, and how carefully. David called his mother that same afternoon. He told her that we knew what she had done, that the investigation had confirmed no abuse, which meant her report had been false, that until she acknowledged what she'd done, admitted it, and apologized in terms that were direct and unambiguous, she would not see Sophie and Oliver again. Patricia's response was measured. It was composed. It was everything she always was. "I reported what I believed to be true," she said. "I did what any grandmother would do who was concerned for her grandchildren's safety. I'm sorry you've chosen to interpret love as a threat." David ended the call. We thought that would be the end of it. 32 days later, a process server appeared at our front door with legal papers. Patricia had filed for grandparents' rights in Bergen County Family Court. The petition stated that she had a long-standing and meaningful relationship with her grandchildren, that the parents had severed that relationship without cause, and that the children would suffer harm from the absence of their paternal grandmother. $1. Her lawyer sent a formal demand letter. In it, Patricia was described as a dedicated, loving grandparent who had only ever acted in the children's best interests. I read the phrase, best interests, and felt something cold move through me. 2 weeks after the petition was filed, we were sitting in a coffee shop in Ridgewood. Patricia, her lawyer, David, me, our lawyer. Mediation, technically. Patricia arrived in pearls and a pale blue silk blouse. She looked like a woman attending a garden party. She looked at me across the table the way you look at someone you've already beaten. Her lawyer laid out the terms: bi-weekly visits, holiday schedule, first right of refusal for childcare. Our lawyer said we rejected the petition entirely. Patricia leaned forward. She spoke directly to me, not to our lawyer. "I want you to know," she said, "that everything I have done has been for Sophie and Oliver. If that cost me your goodwill, I can accept that." "You filed a false abuse report," I said. "I reported what I observed." "You went to our pediatrician's office to pull medical records before you filed it." Her composure flickered. One beat, then back. "I was concerned," she said. "You were building a case," I said, "and it didn't work." She smiled, the smile of a woman who was absolutely certain it was only a matter of time. The hearing was in April. Patricia arrived in court the way she arrived everywhere, dressed precisely, composed completely, radiating the particular confidence of someone who had never seriously considered that things might not go her way. Her lawyer had submitted documentation, Patricia's statements, character references from members of the Greenwich community, a letter from the head of the Ashfield Academy, attesting to her dedication to children's education. Our lawyer had Dr. Helen Yun. Dr. Yun testified for 40 minutes. She was specific, clinical, and devastating in the way that only careful documentation can be. She explained Sophie's bone density finding. She explained why the bruise pattern was consistent with normal activity. She documented the timeline of the phone call to the clinic, the call that preceded the CPS report by 5 days. She didn't accuse Patricia of anything directly. She just described what she had witnessed in the order it had happened, with dates. The court also appointed a child psychologist, Dr. Marcus Ellison, to interview Sophie and Oliver and assess the potential impact of various custody arrangements. His report was submitted to the court 2 weeks before the hearing. The relevant finding: both children showed anxiety-adjacent behaviors during sessions. When their grandmother's name was introduced into conversation, Sophie became quiet and looked toward the door. Oliver began rubbing his elephant's ear, which Dr. Ellison's report noted was a self-soothing behavior he also exhibited when discussing the period of the investigation. Children process things. They don't forget, not even at 3 and 5. The judge was a woman named the Honorable Ruth Barber. She had been on the family bench for 11 years. She asked questions that made clear she had read every document. When she asked Patricia directly whether she would be willing to acknowledge in open court that the CPS report she had filed had been false, and to offer an apology to the parents of her grandchildren, Patricia looked at Judge Barber. She squared her shoulders. She said, "I can't apologize for trying to protect my grandchildren." Judge Barber looked at Patricia for a long moment. Then she made a note. Then she moved on to the next item. The courtroom was quiet in a way that was not comfortable for Patricia. I watched her lawyer touch her arm. I watched her maintain her composure through sheer force of practice. It took 12 days. Our lawyer called at 11:23 in the morning on a Tuesday. I was in the kitchen, Oliver on my hip, Sophie at the table working on a dinosaur puzzle. We had won, parental rights upheld, petition denied, a no-contact order issued pending further review. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I said thank you and hung up. Then I sat down on the kitchen floor and Oliver sat down next to me because he thought it was a game. And Sophie came over from her puzzle and climbed into my lap because Sophie always found her way into a moment. And I sat on the kitchen floor with my kids and thought about the 7 months that had just happened. And I let myself feel all of it. David came home early from the office. He'd gotten the call at work. He walked in and put his briefcase on the table and sat across from me and put his head down on his folded arms. His shoulders shook. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. There wasn't much left to say that we hadn't already said to each other at 2 in the morning, in the dark, during the months when we didn't know how this would end. The aftermath was not clean. Patricia's side of David's family divided the way families do when something like this happens. David's aunt, his father's sister Miriam, called to say she had always suspected Patricia was capable of something like this, and that she was sorry we'd had to find out this way. She was the unexpected ally. She'd watched Patricia over the decades with the particular clarity of someone who'd never been in her orbit of influence. David's father, Edward, said almost nothing publicly, but he showed up at our house one Saturday morning without Patricia, stood on our porch, and spent 20 minutes talking to Oliver about trains. He looked older than I had ever seen him. He didn't apologize for Patricia. He didn't explain her. He just sat on the porch and watched his grandson and looked like a man paying a debt he couldn't articulate. I watched him through the screen door and felt something I hadn't expected to feel, something close to pity. Patricia made 2 more attempts after the ruling. The first was a certified letter, sent through her lawyer, requesting reconsideration of the no-contact order based on new evidence. The new evidence was a letter from a therapist she had begun seeing, framed as evidence of her willingness to engage in personal growth. Our lawyer advised us to ignore it. We did. The second was an email, sent directly to David, not through counsel. A mistake on her part that her lawyer later called a lapse in judgment. In the email, Patricia wrote that she could not understand how her son had come to believe she was capable of malice, that everything she had ever done had been for his benefit, that she hoped when the children were older, they would be able to understand why she had done what she had done. She never named what she had done. She never said the words. Our lawyer advised us to preserve the email. We did. David read it twice and then set his phone down and walked to the window and looked out at the backyard for a long time. "She still thinks she was right," he said. I didn't say anything. There was a grief in the middle of all of this that I don't think I've done justice to yet. Not my grief. David's. He had watched his mother file a false abuse report against his wife. He had spent 7 months watching the state investigate his family. He had stood in a courtroom and heard his mother, given the direct opportunity to to make things right, refused to. He had needed her to be someone other than who she was, and she had refused that too. One night, about 3 weeks after the ruling, I woke up at 2 a.m. and David wasn't in bed. I found him in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the light on over the stove, just sitting. I sat across from him. He said, "I keep thinking about when I was 8. She used to pick me up from school early sometimes, just to take me to lunch. She'd sign me out and we'd go to this diner by the water and she'd let me order anything I wanted. I always got the grilled cheese." He stopped. "I keep trying to figure out how that person and this person are the same person," he said. "And I can't." I reached across the table and held his hand. I didn't tell him they weren't the same person. I didn't tell him that people are consistent underneath, that the woman at the diner and the woman in the courtroom had always been the same woman. That one just hadn't needed anything from him yet. I just held his hand, because some things you have to figure out on your own, and some things you can only do in the kitchen at 2 a.m. with the light over the stove on, and someone across from you who isn't going anywhere. 6 months after the ruling, an envelope arrived at our house. Handwritten address, Patricia's handwriting. I recognized the formal, precise loops. No return address. I almost didn't open it. I did. It was 3 pages. Handwritten, no lawyer, no strategy I could detect. She wrote about the night David was born, about watching him sleep in the bassinet in the hospital room, and understanding for the first time that she was responsible for an entire other person's life, about the fear that had never really left after that. She wrote that she had believed completely and sincerely in the beginning that I was not a safe person for her grandchildren, that she had looked at Sophie's bruises and felt a terror that had overridden every other consideration, that she had told herself she was doing what needed to be done. And then, this was the part I read 3 times, she wrote that somewhere in the 11 weeks of the investigation, when nothing came back the way she'd expected, she had started to understand that what she had believed and what was true were not the same thing, that she had looked at the evidence the same way the investigator had, and seen it differently, and that she had not been able to stop what she had started. She wrote, "I knew before the hearing that I was wrong. I sat in that courtroom knowing I was wrong, and I was too afraid of what admitting it would mean to say so. I am writing this because I am more afraid now of what it will mean if I never do." She did not ask to see the children. She did not ask for anything. She ended the letter by saying that if David ever wanted to speak with her, she would be available, and that if he didn't, she understood, and that she was sorry. Not for the right reasons, maybe. She was sorry, she wrote, in the way someone is sorry when they finally had to look directly at something they'd been avoiding, but she was sorry. I handed it to David without a word. We stood in the kitchen and read it together, and when he was done, he set it on the counter and looked out at the yard where Sophie was running through the sprinkler, and Oliver was standing at the edge watching her with his serious brown eyes, holding his elephant. David didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "I don't know what to do with this." "You don't have to know yet," I said. He nodded. We stood there a little longer. The sprinkler swept across the yard. Sophie shrieked and ran from it and ran back to it. Oliver finally stepped forward and let it hit him on the arm and looked surprised, then satisfied. This is where we are now. Sophie is 6.5. Oliver is 4. They are loud and specific and entirely themselves. Sophie has a new helmet and knee pads because she has moved on from swings to a scooter and shows no signs of becoming more cautious about anything. Oliver has graduated from stuffed elephants to a small collection of model trains that he arranges and rearranges with the methodical care of someone who takes infrastructure seriously. David has started therapy. He didn't say much about it at first. Then one evening he told me it was helping him understand that loving someone and being safe to love are not the same thing, that the two can exist very far apart in the same person, that you can grieve someone who's still alive. I know something now that I didn't know 14 months ago. I know that when someone shows you the length they're willing to go to, you have to believe them, not as a worst-case interpretation, as data. Patricia had a logic she believed. She had convinced herself that her fear was the same as evidence, that her dislike of me was the same as knowing something true about me, and she followed that logic all the way to a courtroom without ever pausing to ask whether it was leading her somewhere she would want to end up. She's still out there, living her life in Greenwich. I don't know what she tells people. I don't know if she tells anyone anything at all. Patricia has spent her whole life managing what people see. That skill doesn't go away just because there's a court order. What I know is that my children are safe. What I know is that they are growing up in a house where the adults around them fight for them instead of against each other. What I know is that Sophie will launch herself off whatever she wants to launch herself off and accumulate bruises like badges. And I will stand there with my heart in my throat and I will let her, because the alternative is to make her small, and she was never built for small. The title of this story was easy to write because it was exactly what happened. She smiled in that courtroom like she'd already won. The composure, the silk blouse, the refusal to apologize even when the judge gave her the clearest possible exit. She was so certain, and she had no idea what was coming. Neither did I, if I'm honest. I didn't know we'd win. I didn't know the letter would come. I didn't know that the thing I most needed, David finally, completely choosing us, would be the thing this whole ordeal forced into the open. Some things only break free under pressure. Some things only become clear when you've been through the worst version of them. I think about that sometimes when Sophie is running through the sprinkler at the end of a summer afternoon, soaking wet, laughing at something only she finds that funny. I think about the 11 weeks we spent scared in our own home. I think about Andrea Moss with her clipboard and her careful eyes. I think about David at 2 in the morning, missing his mother the way you miss someone who was never fully who you needed them to be. And I think, we're still here. That's not nothing. That's everything.